In Cleveland in 1952, Alan Freed packed 20,000 fans into the Moondog Coronation Ball at an arena built for half that crowd, sparking the first rock and roll concert in history. Yet the revolution he unleashed turned on him, leading to the 1959 payola scandal that left him blacklisted and dead at 43. What forces could silence the man who set rock and roll free?
Welcome to Top Spot 40 Music Docuseries, where we bring the stories behind the music to life.
In the flickering glow of a vacuum tube radio, back when the nights felt full of possibility, a voice cut through the static that would change everything we thought we knew about music. That voice belonged to Alan Freed, a man with a preacher's fire and a promoter's grin, who didn't just spin records, he lit a fuse under American culture and gave a name to the explosion that followed, rock and roll. Picture Cleveland, Ohio in the early 1950s. The city was still shaking off the rust of wartime factories, and its teenagers were restless. They were white kids and black kids alike, hungry for sounds that matched the pounding of their hearts. Alan Freed had arrived there in 1950 as a disc jockey with a classical music show that nobody particularly cared about. But something was shifting. Freed began noticing that these young people were scooping up rhythm and blues records, songs by artists like Ivory Joe Hunter and Wynonie Harris, records that most white disc jockeys wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. He started slipping those records into his nighttime program on WJW. Before long, he ditched the Symphony Hour entirely and rebranded the show the Moondog Rock and Roll House Party. He'd howl like a wolf, bang on a telephone book for percussion, and shout out dedications in that unmistakable raspy baritone. Kids across Northeast Ohio huddled close to their radios, volume knobs turned low so their parents wouldn't hear what was coming through the speaker. Because what was coming through was dangerous. It was exciting. It was new. Freed didn't invent the phrase rock and roll. Black churches and blues singers had been using it for years as a coded way of describing both the sacred and the profane. But he was the first to slap that name on a radio show and aim it straight at white teenagers. In doing so, he gave an entire generation permission to claim music that had been bubbling up from Harlem, Memphis, and New Orleans. He called it rock and roll, and suddenly it belonged to everyone. The proof came on a chilly March night in 1952. Freed announced something no one had ever tried before, a live rhythm and blues concert at the Cleveland Arena. He called it the Moondog Coronation Ball. The headliners were the Dominoes, the Orioles, and Veretta Dillard, some of the hottest acts in black music at the time. Tickets were sold through local record stores and word spread like wildfire. By showtime, more than 20,000 kids, many of them black teenagers who had traveled from across the region, descended on an arena built for half that many. The fire marshals shut the doors, but the crowd refused to leave. What happened next was part celebration, part near riot, with broken windows and surging bodies. The police eventually cleared the arena, but history had already been made. Most historians now point to that chaotic night as the first rock and roll concert ever staged. Freed understood what he had touched. The music was more than entertainment. It was a social force. In an America still tightly segregated, his radio show and live events were creating a space where black and white kids stood shoulder to shoulder, dancing to the same songs. He played Little Richard's Tutti Frutti right next to Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock. He championed Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Laverne Baker, and Hank Ballard. He gave them all equal airtime and equal respect. To the kids listening, the color of the singer's skin mattered far less than the way the backbeat made them feel alive. By 1954, the music industry couldn't ignore what was happening in Cleveland. Freed was lured to New York City and Wynn's Radio, where his show became a phenomenon. Rock and Roll Party blasted out across the country's biggest market. He started hosting spectaculars at the Brooklyn Paramount Theater, stage shows that ran for weeks at a time. Picture this: Freed up on stage in a loud sport coat, conducting the crowd like an orchestra while acts like Jerry Lee Lewis pounded the piano so hard the keys seemed to smoke. The screams from those audiences could be heard blocks away. Young girls in bobby socks and boys with ducktail haircuts packed the theaters until the fire department threatened to close them down. It was pandemonium, and Freed loved every second of it. He became more than a disc jockey. He was a Pied Piper, a champion, and, some would later say, a showman who sometimes got carried away with his own legend. But for a shining few years in the mid-1950s, Alan Freed stood at the very center of a cultural earthquake. He appeared in movies like Rock Around the Clock and Don't Knock the Rock, spreading the gospel of the new sound even further. When he waved his arms and shouted, "Go, man, go," into the microphone, it felt like the whole country was rocking right along with him. Yet the very forces he helped unleash eventually turned on him. As rock and roll grew bigger, it became more threatening to the old guard. Parents groups, politicians, and rival disc jockeys began looking for ways to tame the beast. In 1959, the payola scandal erupted. Payola, the practice of record companies giving gifts or cash to jockeys in return for airplay, had been an open secret for years. Almost everyone in radio did it to some degree. But Freed became the poster boy for the crusade. He was accused of accepting bribes, hauled before congressional committees, and eventually fired from wins. His reputation was dragged through the mud. Blacklisted from many stations, he struggled to find work. The man who had once commanded the attention of millions now found himself increasingly isolated. The final chapters of Alan Freed's story are tinged with sadness. He battled alcohol, faced legal troubles, and watched as newer, cleaner-cut stars like Dick Clark took center stage. He died in Palm Springs in 1965 at the age of just 43, his heart worn out. At his funeral, only a handful of people stood in the rain to say goodbye. It seemed like a cruelly quiet ending for someone who had once made so much noise. But here's what time has revealed. Alan Freed's real legacy wasn't in the scandals or the headlines. It was in the music he fought to play and the barriers he helped knock down. Because of him, a white kid in suburban Ohio could fall in love with the voice of Ruth Brown. A black teenager in Alabama could hear his own experience reflected in the wild guitar of Chuck Berry. Rock and roll became the first truly integrated popular art form in America, and Freed was one of its earliest and loudest champions. Today, when you hear the opening riff of Johnny B. Good, or the joyous shout of "Oh-wah-bop-a-loo-bop" bursting from car speakers on a summer afternoon, you're hearing the echo of a man who believed music could cross every line society tried to draw. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, fittingly located in the same Cleveland where it all began, inducted him in its very first class. They understood what we still feel in our bones, that before there could be a Beatles or a Rolling Stones, before there could be Woodstock or MTV, there had to be a fearless disc jockey willing to turn up the volume and shout a brand new name into the night. Alan Freed didn't just play rock and roll, he set it free. And every time the music makes us want to dance, holler, or feel a little more alive, we're still answering his call.
Thank you for joining us for Top Spot 40 Music Docuseries. Discover all the stories behind the music at topspot40.com. Until next time, keep the music playing.